If you asked anyone who knew John Haigh in 1947 in London to describe him, they might use words like handsome, smart, well-dressed, and a totally respectable member of society. The image he projected was pretty charming, like a beautiful sunset. But unfortunately, behind it all, he was a liar, a con artist, and one of the most brutal serial killers who dissolved his victims in acid. Probably not the best way to make friends, right? John Haigh was born in Stamford, England, on July 24, 1909, and grew up in the small village of Outward with his parents, John and Emily Haigh. Unfortunately, John didn't have any siblings or close friends to play with as a kid, and his parents were pretty reclusive. So, most of what we know about his childhood comes from John's own statements when he was interrogated by psychologists after he was arrested and charged with his string of murders. Of course, who wouldn't want to look good in front of others, even if it's just through their own stories? Back then, everyone knew the Haigh family wasn't living in luxury, but they weren't poor either. The small family was described as middle class. John's parents, John Sr. and Emily, were members of a very conservative and anti-modern Protestant sect called the Plymouth Brethren. They constantly reminded their son that God was watching his every move, especially when little John was planning something he shouldn't be doing. And let's be honest, if you grew up with reminders like that, who wouldn't want to try a little bit of fun crime? With all that pressure, it's no wonder John felt the need to do something dramatic to get attention. John's faith was way different from his parents. He wanted to break free from those confusing and ambiguous beliefs. Maybe he thought, if God is watching, I should put on a show worth watching. Not a magic show with rabbits out of hats, but something way more dramatic. Maybe he hoped to turn that rigid faith into something more exciting, like hosting a hidden talents show in the sky. Who knows? Maybe if he caught God's attention, he'd give a big round of applause, though it seems like a pretty questionable way to earn some recognition. His dad often said, "Don't do anything that'll make God sad, because that won't please him." Apparently, John Sr. had some extreme beliefs about the afterlife and saw the world as a messed up, evil place. Meanwhile, he looked forward to eternal life with God in heaven, probably thinking, finally, no more noisy neighbors. He even built a 6 to 8 foot wall around their house to keep the family separate from the other villagers, whom he thought were bad influences. Back then, the English were getting into all sorts of trouble, like having premarital sex and doing other things strictly forbidden by conservative Protestant teachings. John Sr. felt like he had to protect his family from the virus of sin infecting the neighbors he deemed inferior in faith. He was terrified that if he wasn't careful, his family might start throwing nighttime barbecue parties, and that was enough to make God anxious. Because of his parents' beliefs, John grew up in isolation, hanging out only with his pets and the neighbor's dog as his buddies. In a world that should have been full of color, he only had two, black and white. Even though John later realized that everything his parents did was out of love and big hopes for his future, he admitted to experiencing anxiety and terrifying nightmares from his super religious upbringing. Maybe back then, his dreams felt more like horror movies than peaceful Sunday school lessons. John Sr. had a little blue scar on his forehead, which he called a mark from the devil. He warned his son that if he ever sinned, he'd get marked too. When little John asked why his mom didn't have a mark like that, his dad said it was because Emily was an angel. Maybe that's why his mom never told him to clean his room. Angels are definitely more patient. A lot of the time, John would lie in bed, thinking about all the naughty things he'd done, with his hand resting on his forehead. He wondered if he'd wake up with that blue mark, but it never showed up, no matter how misbehaved John was. Maybe God was too busy dealing with bigger issues, like wrapping up a love story gone wrong between two angels in heaven. The absence of that mark eventually made him believe that he couldn't be hurt by God, who he thought was like a ghost, invisible and more like a fairy tale. From there, his faith started to fade, and he leaned more into his rebellious side. After all, there's nothing sadder than a kid with no playmates who ends up spending time alone, treating his imagination as his best buddy, even if his imagination never asked him to clean up. Even though John Sr. painted his son as a good kid who never did anything wrong and was friendly with other kids, the reality wasn't quite so rosy. The other kids tended to steer clear of him, probably because little John was more of a troublemaker than their older siblings. Some villagers even had some pretty different stories to tell. They remembered little John as a mischievous kid who loved to pinch the ears of little girls without a shred of mercy. He was seriously good at pinching, like it was some extreme sport, one neighbor said. Not only that, but he also spat on them and cursed like he just took a lesson from a ninja. The younger boys weren't safe from John's attacks either. He liked to hit or kick them before darting back to his own front gate, like a superhero who just wrapped up a mission, hiding from the parents of the kids he tormented. You could say he was more of an anti-hero, but without a costume and with way more ethical violations. John Haigh actually lived in Wakefield, England, at various points in his life. After his childhood in Stamford, he moved around, including to Wakefield, before getting involved in a series of murders in London. His ties to the local community and his background in Wakefield played a part in shaping his complex character. One Wakefield resident still remembers a run-in with little John and didn't hesitate to report it to the police. One day, I was carrying my blazer over my arm when he suddenly popped up from behind and snatched it. Then he grabbed my arm and tossed my blazer right onto the train tracks. While still holding on to me, he said, "There's an express train coming, and it's going to run you over, cutting you into tiny pieces, and blood will be everywhere." It sounded like he had just watched way too many crime horror movies. Unfortunately, trying to talk to John's parents about his daring behavior was totally pointless. They were hard to approach, pretty anarchic, and seemed to prefer hiding behind the 6-foot wall they built themselves. John Sr., who worked as a senior employee at the coal mine, had a reputation for being a serious headache for anyone who complained about his precious kid. So instead of reporting him, the neighbors just opted to look the other way and hoped John wouldn't make them his next target. At school, it was said that John wasn't exactly popular. He was naughty, but pretty smart. He was a bright kid, but academics didn't really interest him much. You could say classes were just a passing breeze for him. Still, John managed to snag a scholarship to Queen Elizabeth Grammar School in Wakefield, and another one to Wakefield Cathedral, where he became a choir boy. Who would have thought, right? A serial killer who could also sing? At home, John learned to play the piano, and apparently, he was pretty good at it. People would gather to listen to him play, but sometimes he'd suddenly stand up, slam the piano lid shut, and walk off without a word. Maybe he thought his performances were enough to disturb the neighbors, and it was time to give them a bit of drama. With his habit of surprising people and being all quiet, no one really knew what was going on in Hay's head. It was like John's thoughts were an unfinished symphony, sometimes beautiful, sometimes horrifying, but always intriguing. After finishing school, John bounced around jobs in insurance and advertising, trying to find the right fit. But he quickly realized that the pay wasn't cutting it for the lifestyle he wanted. He needed cash for all the business ideas he had, so he turned to fraud to make quick money. By the time he was 21, he got fired for secretly stealing from the company's cash box. After that, John started faking car documents, and a few years later, in 1934, he married a woman named Beatrice Betty Hamer. But their marriage didn't last long because John's crimes caught up with him, and he was arrested and jailed for fraud. While her husband was behind bars, Betty gave birth to a daughter, who she put up for adoption because, at the time, farm life was tough, and she thought adoption was the best option for John's kid. Before Beatrice ended things with John, his very conservative family didn't want to deal with him anymore because they were embarrassed by his legal troubles. When John got out 2 years later, he left everything behind and moved to London. But there was one thing John couldn't shake off from his past: his knack for crime. In London, Haigh worked as a driver for William McSwan, the owner of an arcade. While fixing McSwan's machines, it was like he was saying, "Look, I can fix this machine, but I could make more money machines that fly under the radar." Before long, John decided to move on to bigger and more illegal things. Maybe he thought slot machines were just too mainstream. He set up a fake law office and, under the alias William Cato Adamson, Haigh started selling fake stocks and bonds, supposedly from the estates of his deceased clients. Who needs a real inheritance when you can create your own inheritance? In John's mind, being a con artist might be more exciting than hitting the jackpot, though I guess the uncertainty of the outcome was the extra spice that made it all the more thrilling. However, this scheme didn't last long because someone got suspicious after spotting mistakes on a legal document. Ah, legal documents. Always a headache, like finding hair in your food. John got arrested again and was slapped with another 4-year sentence for his uncovered fraud, though he was released early in 1940. He spent the next few years going in and out of prison, almost like he was training for a prison athlete program. While he was in jail, John realized that his biggest weakness in his schemes was leaving his victims alive, like leaving an open pizza on the table while everyone's hungry. They're bound to complain. If he wanted to keep conning people, John had to find a way to get rid of the witnesses to his crimes. Now, this is where I started to get a bit worried. Seriously, planning a serial murder for financial gain? That sounds like an idea straight out of a bad thriller movie. Come on, John, let's try to do something a bit better, like being a barista at a cafe or opening a bakery. At least no one has to lose their life there. John started doing some research and eventually stumbled upon the crimes of George Alexandre Sarret, a French killer infamous for his signature method, dissolving his victims in sulfuric acid. Of course, John felt inspired, but we all know that drawing inspiration from notorious murderers isn't the best way to achieve success. Instead of developing an app to manage finances, he spent his time on experiments that felt more like something out of a creepy science lab. John began experimenting with rats, and in about 30 minutes, those little critters were completely dissolved. Pretty amazing. It seemed like John had found a quick way to get rid of rats without needing to call in an exterminator. He thought, if I can dissolve rats, then adults should be no problem. With the enthusiasm of a slightly twisted scientist, John started calculating how much acid and time it would take to dissolve an adult body. He even thought about budgeting for purchasing the acid. Who knew that killing required not just skill, but also solid financial planning? After figuring out the perfect method for murder, John confidently thought, if there's no body, there's no money. If there's no body, then there won't be any charges. Honestly, it felt like he had just discovered a super unconventional business strategy. But let's face it, if there's one thing that's for sure, he definitely wouldn't be winning any Best Murder Dad awards at the family reunion. John was released from prison again in 1943 and worked at a garage workshop for a while, living with the owner, Alan Stevens, and his family. While staying there, John started a relationship with Alan's 15-year-old daughter, Barbara. One night, while visiting a pub in Kensington, John spotted a familiar face, William McSwan. William was thrilled to see his old buddy and invited him to meet his parents, Donald and Amy. They talked about how William had sold his entertainment business and was now raking in a ton of money, renting out properties to tenants. John was living with Barbara's parents in their London home because he worked for the family. But instead of feeling happy for his friend or former boss, John was filled with intense jealousy. His envy only grew when he saw William's lavish lifestyle. Maybe he thought, the only thing better than being rich is getting rid of the rich guy. Spotting the perfect opportunity to execute his gruesome murder plan, John felt like a kid who found candy in the pantry. After a few meetings with the McSwan family, on September 6, 1944, John lured William into a basement he rented on Gloucester Road. There, instead of serving tea and cakes, John decided to set the mood by smashing William's head with a metal bar. Definitely not the best way to welcome a guest. After that, he went on to slit William's throat. Seriously, who knew that a romantic dinner plan could turn into a horror show?
Don't miss this exciting story. Watch this video until the end to get all the surprising detail. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. That way you won't miss out on any other interesting videos. Join our community and enjoy various exciting stories every week.
In his diary, Haigh wrote, "I took a cup and collected blood from his neck, then drank it." After the murder, he reportedly left William's body in the basement overnight before returning the next day to check on his calculations. He took all of William's valuables before stuffing the corpse into a 40-gallon drum and filling it with concentrated sulfuric acid. Haigh had to step back because he was hit by toxic fumes and left the basement while the body dissolved. 2 days later, John returned to his makeshift lab and checked on his project. All that was left of William McSwan's body was a thick black liquid, which John poured down the drain. After getting rid of William, John moved into William's house and took over the task of collecting rent from the tenants, telling Donald and Amy that their son had fled to Scotland to avoid conscription. William trusted Haigh to keep up this illusion, to take control of his assets, creating a story about traveling to Scotland and sending postcards to the McSwans, pretending to be William. This worked for a while, but they grew increasingly suspicious as the war came to an end and their son remained in hiding. Of course, John had a quick fix for this situation. What's next in John Haigh's twisted scheme to take over this wealthy family's assets? Just like he did with William, John lured Donald and Amy to Gloucester Road on July 2, 1945, killed them, and dissolved their bodies in acid. By this point, Haigh had set up a steel bathtub and breathing apparatus in his twisted workshop. After the murders, John claimed that the McSwans had gone to the United States and fooled people by pretending to work on their behalf. He managed to sell the McSwans' property and steal their pension checks. With about £8,000 in his pocket, which is roughly £408,000 in today's money, John moved into the Onslow Court Hotel in Kensington. Unfortunately, he burned through that cash in less than a year due to his growing gambling issues. Eventually, John had to look for new victims to kill, and by 1947, John Haigh pretended to be interested in buying a house from a wealthy couple, Archibald and Rose Henderson. He told the Hendersons about his piano skills and was quickly invited to play at their housewarming party in their new flat. During the party, John stole Archibald's revolver. As the Hendersons started to trust Haigh more, he arranged for the equipment to dissolve his victims' bodies to be moved to a nearby storage unit on Leopold Road, Crawley. He also ordered 2 more 40-gallon drums along with additional acid. On February 12, 1946, Haigh lured Archibald Henderson to Crawley before shooting him in the head with his own revolver. After that, John stuffed Archibald's body into the storage unit, then picked up Rose and did the same to her. He started dissolving their bodies, but this time, not everything turned into sludge. When John returned, Rose's legs were still mostly intact. At this point, Haigh felt invincible, and since his new workshop didn't have a drainage system, he just dumped the sludge along with the legs into a pile of debris behind the property. As before, he forwarded their mail and sold off the victims' belongings, making over £8,000, probably even more than that. In fact, John gave some of Rose's dresses to Barbara Stevens, who was still his girlfriend. When Rose's brother said he was going to the police, Haigh claimed the couple had fled to South Africa after Archibald had an illegal abortion. John thought he could handle anything thrown at him. No one was chasing him. There were no bodies to be found, and no one could connect him to the disappearances of his victims, or so he thought. After all, there was no Facebook back then, and no social media to track down missing people. The ease of killing his victims probably gave John a false sense of security. By February 1949, he was in financial trouble again. He was late on his hotel bills and owed money to several commission agents. But then an opportunity to get out of his mess came in the form of a wealthy widow named Henrietta Olive Duran Deacon. Olive, who also lived at the Onslow Court Hotel, was a respectable and talented woman in her late 60s. One day, she sat at the same table as John and was thrilled to find out that her new acquaintance had once worked at an engineering company. Olive had a creative idea to make fake nails and thought, hey, maybe John can help. Before jumping into this dangerous nail art project, she should have thought twice about visiting John's workshop. Maybe she was wondering, why am I here? Should I bring snacks or a movie ticket? On February 18, 1949, Olive fell right into John's trap and ended up in his basement. Just like the unfortunate Henderson and McSwan families, this naive widow was captured. She was shot with John's stolen .38 Webley revolver and then disposed of in a vat of acid. Within days, her body turned into sludge. Her plans for fake nails became meaningless. Imagine if Olive had known she was making fake nails in the workshop of a serial killer. She probably would have thought, this is not the right place for nail art. Where were all the necessary pedicure tools? There's nothing more stressful than going to a salon that ends up in a crime report. But this time, John made a big mistake in picking his victim. Olive's disappearance was quickly noticed by her friend, Constance Lane, who already knew Olive was planning to meet a guy named, yep, you guessed it, John Haigh. So Constance wasted no time and reported it to the police. An investigation kicked off, and John's criminal background got revealed like the first page of a ripped book, totally exposed. Still, John put on a show, pretending to care. He even gave an interview at the hotel with a face full of fake concern, saying, I really hope Mrs. Duran Deacon is found safe. Yeah, right, John. Everyone can see you're just acting. But the police weren't fooled. They quickly searched his workshop in Crawley, and that's when the big drama began. Of course, when the cops searched the place, they could only scratch their heads at the big drums that looked full of sludge. At first, they were still clueless. Maybe they thought, maybe John's starting an organic fertilizer business. But once they took a closer look, they were like, whoa, something's off here. John, on the other hand, must have been praying they wouldn't discover his secret recipe, like making sausages from human fat. Yikes. Unfortunately for him, John Haigh wasn't the great cleaner he thought he was. During the search, the police found drums filled with 40 gallons of concentrated sulfuric acid, along with 28 pounds of human fat. That's not all. They also found gallstones, a souvenir perhaps, part of a left leg, 18 bone fragments, and both upper and lower dentures that belonged to Olive. Oh, and as a bonus, there was also a laundry receipt for Olive's coat, just in case the police needed more evidence. Referring to the Henderson and McSwan cases, John was finally arrested on February 26, 1949. Even with all the evidence piling up, John still felt untouchable, like he had a bulletproof charm. He casually told the detective, Miss Duran Deacon is gone. I dissolved her in acid. You can't prove murder without a body. As if the police would just back down like that, right? But wait, plot twist. Just when the detectives thought John had only 5 victims, he suddenly made a shocking confession. Oh yeah, besides the McSwans and Hendersons, I also killed a young guy named Max, a girl from Eastbourne, and a woman from Hammersmith. So that makes a total of 8 victims. The detectives who heard his confession must have been like, wait, what's with these 3 extras? A bonus? Ironically, the 3 extra murders he claimed could never be proven. It's like he was putting in extra orders at a restaurant, but the server only wrote down half of them. Even though John thought that the prosecutors didn't need the whole body to make their case, as if just a few body parts would be enough, the trial went ahead on July 18th and 19th, 1949 in Luz. This is where John tried to pull off a crazy defense, literally. He claimed he was a vampire who drank his victim's blood. Okay, drinking cobra blood might still be seen as normal by some, but human blood? Yikes, that's just gross. For us normal folks, just hearing that is pretty chilling. John definitely took the whole creepy concept to an unnecessary level. They even brought in a psychiatrist for a private consultation to help the prosecution wrap up their case. John claimed all of this started from a nightmare he had as a kid, saying, "I saw a forest of crosses in front of me that gradually turned into trees of fire. At first it looked like dew or rain dripping from the branches, but those droplets were hot, and I realized it was blood. In the darkness of night, the forest started moving, and the tall, dark trees were oozing blood. A man appeared from each tree, collecting the dripping blood. When his cup was full, he came closer, his eyes glowing terrifyingly, and said, 'Drink.' But I was frozen in fear, unable to move at all. The horror enveloped me, as if this nightmare was about to come true." Even though John seemed very disturbed, a defense based on insanity doesn't hold up if there's evidence that the defendant acted with malicious intent and careful planning. I mean, what shows intent better than asking the detectives after he was caught, "Tell me honestly, what are my chances of getting out of Broadmoor?" Really sounds like someone who doesn't know. He just killed 8 people. If you didn't know, Broadmoor is a high-security psychiatric hospital. So yeah, John had a backup plan, but unfortunately, the expert psychological and psychiatric witnesses weren't fooled. The jury? They took just 17 minutes to come back with a guilty verdict. John probably finished quicker than we do waiting for popcorn in the microwave. On August 10th, 1949, John Haigh was sentenced to hang for his crimes at Wandsworth Prison. Ironically, he was buried with his body intact, a simplicity he never gave his victims. That morning, a huge crowd gathered outside the main gates of Wandsworth, waiting for the historic moment. And when the execution announcement was posted, cheers erupted as if they had just won the lottery, or at least gotten John Haigh out of this world. So make sure you don't miss out on other dark and mysterious stories. Take care, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button on Ifelt the Dark so you won't miss any tales that'll make you say, "Wow, didn't see that coming."